Think about this. The news you rely on, maybe it isn't just a clear window onto the world. What if it's more like a lens, subtly bending reality?
Yeah, it's interesting. Even Walter Cronkite, the epitome of trustworthy news, eventually said that whole idea of pure objectivity, well, it just wasn't quite right.
So that really begs the question, doesn't it? How much is what we see and hear actually shaping, maybe even creating our understanding of things?
That's exactly what we're exploring today, diving into Michael Parenti's book, Inventing Reality, The Politics of News Media.
Parenti's work, right. He doesn't just talk about mistakes or the odd bias report, does he?
No, not at all. His core argument is that the way news media misrepresents social and political life isn't random. He believes it's often systematic, stemming from, well, deeper ideological and economic forces.
Okay, systematic. That's a strong claim.
It is. And for you, our listener, someone who wants to grasp complex stuff quickly but thoroughly without feeling totally overwhelmed, we think this discussion will give some really useful aha moments about media dynamics.
And before we jump right into Parenti's examples, we wanted to mention a resource you might find helpful for digging deeper into topics like this one.
Oh, yeah. There's a YouTube channel called Mindful Moments. They use AI to analyze books, and it's really geared towards sparking reflection and critical thinking on all sorts of subjects. Could be great follow-up.
Good tip. Okay, so let's get into Parenti's main point, this idea that the reality the news shows us needs a critical look. He kicks off by tackling that big, ideal media objectivity.
Exactly. He flat out argues the media aren't consistently objective, nor are they always accurate. But the crucial part is his claim that the big distortions, the major skews, aren't just one-offs.
They're repeatable, systemic.
Yes, repeatable and systemic. Think about how certain ideas, especially ones that fit snugly into the dominant political culture, just start to feel like, well, like common sense.
Like the natural order of things.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And once an idea reaches that status, it becomes really hard to even see it as a viewpoint, let alone challenge it effectively.
It sort of becomes invisible, the default setting. So how do we even start to notice these built-in distortions if they feel so natural?
Well, Parenti really emphasizes the importance of dissenting voices, of viewpoints that push against that mainstream narrative.
Because they force you to see the assumptions.
Exactly. When you encounter a challenging perspective, it makes you examine the bedrock of your own understanding. This clash of ideas, even opposing ones, is actually vital for inching closer to a more accurate picture. It's about testing beliefs, not just accepting them.
And Parenti wasn't working in a vacuum here. He points to other analyses, right?
Oh, absolutely. He references work from dissenting publications and media watchdog groups, places like The Nation, Extra, and Propaganda Review. They often highlight the very same kinds of systemic patterns he discusses.
Okay. Now, one specific bias Parenti talks about might catch people off guard. He argues there's often a pro-Republican, pro-conservative tilt in the press.
Right, and that definitely kind of against the grain of the common liberal media complaint, doesn't it?
It really does. What evidence does he use for that?
He looks at things like surveys of newspaper endorsements over time. Presidential elections, for instance. He points out a pretty consistent pattern of papers backing Republican and conservative candidates far more often than not.
So actual endorsement.
Yes. And he also analyzes how specific candidates get traded. He contrasts, for example, the intense media focus on certain issues for some Democratic figures, like Quayle versus Biden or Gary Hart, compared to, say, the relative lack of scrutiny on similar or even bigger alleged issues for figures like George Bush Sr.
That comparison is striking. It makes you wonder about the selective amplification, what gets magnified, what gets minimized.
Definitely. And it's not just about the two main parties either. Parenti discusses the marginalization of third-party candidates. He uses Barry Commoner as an example, someone with real credentials. But once he declared his candidacy, he essentially became a media non-person.
Vanished from the mainstream coverage, which of course narrows the whole political conversation.
It does. And Parenti argues this isn't just accidental or about individual journalists' preferences. He links it directly to the structure of media ownership.
It's a concentration of ownership.
Exactly. More and more media outlets owned by fewer, larger corporations, often with influential, wealthy conservatives involved at the top levels. He even mentions the interlocking directorates, like bank representatives sitting on media company boards.
So the potential for bias is kind of built into the economic structure itself. It's not just opinion.
That's his argument. And beyond ownership, there's the advertiser influence. Media outlets rely on ad revenue, right? Parenti suggests this dependency can subtly shape content. He brings up examples like national magazines, Life, and Gasak. Look, that tackled some tough social issues, but struggled financially when TV became the big ad platform. Economic pressures are always there.
Okay, so beyond outright bias, let's talk about those more subtle methods Parenti identifies, like framing and omission. This seems key to how reality gets constructed.
Absolutely key. Framing is all about how a story is presented, what's highlighted, what context is provided, and crucially, what context is left out. Omission is simpler, just leaving important information out entirely.
Can you give an example of framing?
Sure. Think about how poverty or slums are often covered. Parenti notes they might be presented as isolated problems, maybe focusing on crime or decay, but without connecting them to broader issues like, say, wage stagnation, lack of affordable housing, or historical injustices.
So the focus stays on the symptom, not the potential systemic cause.
Exactly. It avoids a critique of the larger system. Similarly, he argues that corporate capitalism itself is often framed as just the natural default way things are, maybe even inherently good. The contradictions, like how maximizing profit might require keeping wages low, often don't get explored very deeply.
And recessions.
Often presented almost like bad weather, unfortunate but unavoidable natural cycles, rather than perhaps the result of specific policies or inherent flaws in the economic system.
Parenti also touches on representation, right? How different groups appear in the news.
Yes, definitely. He points out that the ongoing struggles of, say, African Americans, Latinos, and other ethnic minority groups often receive limited coverage. But conversely, he notes data showing African Americans might be overrepresented in reporting on crime.
That creates a skewed perception.
It certainly can. He also mentions the often unsympathetic press Jesse Jackson received, especially when his campaigns challenged the establishment or brought up uncomfortable truths. There was also sexism in the media workplace itself, he noted, citing issues reported at the St. Petersburg Times.
It really underscores whose stories get centered and how they're told. Okay, let's shift to the direct influence of government and business beyond just ownership.
Parenti argues the press often ends up acting almost like a public relations channel for government leaders, especially the president. Favorable coverage is quite common.
He gave an example with Reagan, I think.
Yes. Reagan claimed his administration was advancing minority and female interests. Parenti points out this was often reported fairly uncritically, without much digging into whether the actual policies and their outcomes matched the rhetoric.
And it's not passive, is it? The government actively tries to manage the news.
Oh, very actively. Parenti describes things like the White House sending out daily lines of the day, specific messages they want pushed, and direct calls from officials to network executives to shape coverage.
And if the coverage isn't favorable?
Well, there can be consequences. Parenti mentions government retaliation, anything from denying access to briefings or interviews to withholding information, applying pressure in various ways.
Which you have to assume leads to a certain amount of self-censorship among journalists and editors.
That's the implication. People learn pretty quickly what the acceptable lines are, what topics are sensitive, and what happens if you cross those lines. Parenti also talks about the revolving door.
People moving between journalism jobs and government jobs.
Exactly. Which can, perhaps subtly, align perspectives and priorities. He even notes historical, documented links between intelligence agencies like the CIA and certain news organizations or executives. It's quite a web of influence.
It really is. Thinking about all these connections, ownership, government pressure, the revolving door, it's complex. This might actually be a good moment to remind you, our listener, about resources like Mindful Moments on YouTube, or even checking out our other podcast discussions where we sometimes unpack similar dynamics of media and power.
Good point. These issues are deep. And we haven't even fully circled back to mass advertising's role.
Right, we touched on it, but it's more than just funding, isn't it?
Yes. Advertising doesn't just pay the bills. It actively promotes a whole ideology centered around consumption. Parenti gives examples like defense contractors, whose ads might present a very sanitized image of their work, or groups like the Advertising Council.
What about the Ad Council?
He suggests they often push campaigns that frame societal problems as needing individual solutions, like just say no, or focus on recycling, rather than tackling the bigger systemic causes, like poverty or corporate pollution.
It shifts the focus away from collective action or policy change.
Pretty much. And this ties into what Parenti sees as a generally pro-business, sometimes anti-labor bias in media. He points to how Reagan's tax cuts, which heavily favored the wealthy, got fairly positive framing, while potential tax increases on the wealthy were often downplayed or ignored.
And labor disputes, strikes.
Often, the narrative tends to blame labor unions or striking workers focusing on disruption, while management's role in creating the conflict gets much less attention. He even contrasts the negative coverage of U.S. coal strikes with sometimes more sympathetic coverage of strikes in the Soviet Union back then.
The pattern seems to favor the status quo, the established powers.
Okay, but what about that persistent idea of the liberal media? How does Parenti tackle that narrative?
He confronts it head on. He uses evidence like those newspaper endorsements we mentioned, the consistent favoring of Republican presidential candidates, to argue against a pervasive liberal bias.
So the data doesn't really support the claim, not according to his analysis. Instead, he argues the media exerts power by controlling opinion visibility. They can shape the perception of public mood by constantly reporting on, say, a conservative shift, or by discrediting or downplaying protests. They influence what issues even make it onto the public agenda.
So it's less about biased reporting on every single issue and more about shaping the overall landscape of acceptable debate.
That's a good way to put it. And he notes that the conservative movement has been very effective at influencing the mainstream by first introducing themes in its own publications, which then gradually filter into wider media discussion.
He also examines how protests themselves are covered, and it sounds like there's a real discrepancy there.
There often is. He argues the coverage of protests challenging government policy or corporate power is frequently minimal, maybe focusing on arrests or disruptions rather than the substance of the protest. He uses the March on the Pentagon during Vietnam as an example of this trivializing coverage.
And how does that compare to other demonstrations?
He contrasts it sharply with the often generous positive coverage given to anti-communist demonstrations like Polish Solidarity Day events, even if the turnout was much smaller.
So the type of protest matters a lot in terms of coverage.
It seems so. He even points to the Gulf War period, where small pro-war counter-demonstrations sometimes received equal or even more airtime than much larger anti-war protests happening simultaneously.
That selective spotlight is powerful. Now, Parenti goes deep into the historical relationship between the U.S. media and anything perceived as leftist or communist.
Yeah.
The whole Red Menace narrative.
Yes. He traces a long history of media hostility towards leftist governments and movements, both here and abroad. He finds examples going way back to the early 20th century, where any kind of domestic labor unrest was immediately linked to the Soviet menace.
Fear-mongering, essentially.
You could call it that. He also contrasts the consistently negative portrayal of the Soviet Union over decades, with, interestingly, some quite positive early coverage of Mussolini's Italy and even Hitler's Germany before the war.
Wow. So anything challenging the existing capitalist order was framed as alien and dangerous?
That seems to be the pattern he identifies. This anti-communist thread ran right through the Cold War. He argues the media often supported anti-labor laws like Taft-Hartley, framed as fighting communism, and routinely downplayed or dismissed any peace overtures or conciliatory signals from the Soviet side.
Even during the collapse of communism.
Even then, he suggests the coverage was biased. It often celebrated the changes without fully acknowledging, say, the social safety nets that were being dismantled or the lack of democratic traditions in some of those countries before communism. Those pushing for rapid free market reforms were labeled Democrats, while anyone resisting was a hardliner or Stalinist.
And the downsides of those free market transitions.
Often downplayed or misrepresented. He uses the example of rising homelessness in Hungary after the shift, suggesting it wasn't adequately reported or contextualized in the Western press.
This framing clearly extends to how U.S. foreign policy and interventions are reported, too.
Absolutely. Parenti argues the media frequently sanitize or justify the use of U.S. power, especially military force, against countries that don't toe the U.S. line. Nicaragua under the Sandinistas is a major case study for him.
What did he find there?
That positive developments, literacy campaigns, healthcare improvements were largely ignored, while the focus was overwhelmingly on alleged Sandinista repression or ties to Cuba and the Soviets. He contrasts the huge outcry over press freedom in Nicaragua with the relative silence about violence against journalists in U.S. allied pro-capitalist states in the region.
It's that selective focus again. We saw similar things later, didn't we? The demonization of leaders like Noriega right before the U.S. invasion of Panama.
Exactly. Or the shifting justifications given for the first Gulf War, alongside the intense demonization of Saddam Hussein, which Parenti argues served to dehumanize the conflict.
And he suggests the media often censored themselves.
Yes, particularly regarding the human costs of wars like the Gulf War. He points to suppression of dissenting views and a reluctance to show the real impact on civilians. He also mentions historical examples, like the media largely suppressing news about the impending Bay of Pigs invasion.
And this concept of anti-Americanism.
Parenti argues it's often portrayed in the media as this irrational hatred of America, rather than potentially being a specific political response to U.S. foreign policies and interventions that people disagree with or suffer from.
It shuts down criticism by labeling it irrational.
That's the effect. He also discusses how the media rarely focuses on how U.S. policies might actually support repressive elites or hinder genuine social development in many third world countries. He gives examples from Guatemala, El Salvador,
Where U.S.-backed forces were involved in major human rights abuses, but the coverage was often skewed.
yes, downplaying the U.S. role or the nature of the regimes being supported. Even popular reformist leaders like Father Aristide in Haiti often receive surprisingly negative or skeptical press coverage in the U.S.
It seems like any attempt by a smaller country to control its own resources or destiny independently is framed negatively.
Often labeled as economic mismanagement or instability, yeah. And he also points to pervasive negative stereotypes, particularly of Arabs, which became especially pronounced during conflicts like the Gulf War.
So framing, omission, bias, representation. Parenti also mentions other techniques briefly.
Right, things like actively promoting disinformation, sometimes accepting official lies at face value, creating a false balance between vastly unequal sides, relying on a narrow range of official sources, and even using headlines, photo choices, and story placement to subtly influence perception. The whole range of tools.
It really is a comprehensive look at how the news picture can be shaped. So bringing this all together, if you, our listener, have been following this, you can probably see how understanding these dynamics Parenti lays out is, well, it's crucial for making sense of the information washing over us constantly.
Absolutely. Knowing about potential systemic biases, about framing, about the influence of ownership in government, it equips you to be a much more critical news consumer.
It helps you look beneath the surface, question the narrative, and maybe build a more robust, nuanced understanding for yourself.
Precisely. It's about moving from passive reception to active engagement with the information.
So just to quickly recap our conversation today, we've journeyed through Michael Parenti's central argument in Inventing Reality, that the news media, far from being purely objective mirrors, often systematically shape reality due to ideological and economic structures.
We looked at the myth of objectivity, the evidence for certain systemic biases like a pro-conservative leaning in some areas, the power of framing and omission, and the significant influence of media owners, advertisers, and government actors.
We also touched on how protests are covered differently, the historical anti-leftist narratives, the often sanitized portrayal of U.S. foreign policy, and the various subtle techniques used to shape perception.
Ultimately, the goal isn't to make you cynical about all news, but to make you a more discerning, critical reader and viewer.
Exactly. So we really encourage you, if you found this discussion valuable, subscribe to our show for more analyses like this. Share it with friends or colleagues who appreciate critical thinking.
And if you're inclined to support the show, you can check out the purchase links for related materials in our show notes. Every little bit helps us continue these conversations.
And most importantly, keep questioning. Keep thinking critically about the media you consume every single day.
So we'll leave you with this final thought to mull over. In this age, absolutely saturated with information, what responsibility do you personally feel you have to actively seek out diverse perspectives, to go beyond the easy narratives, and to truly challenge the versions of reality presented to you?